Yes, okay. Good evening and welcome to our second annual Frederick Douglass Read Aloud. I'm Courtney from the library, and I want to thank you so much for being here. Thanks to our readers for their courage and our speaker for her time and expertise. So after this brief introduction, we'll dive into the reading, which will take about 40 minutes, and then we'll hear from Dr. Tina Ligon. If I could ask everyone to mute until, for now, the time being. Let's see. All right. So first of all, if you could please keep your microphone muted unless you are the reader or the next in line to read. If you volunteered to read but did not receive your assigned paragraphs, please message me in the chat, Courtney. And a reminder to all of us to have patience, as we are sure to have some stumbling, either with the dense emotional text or with the technology, but we will get through. One little note, at the end of this speech, there is a unison section, which is wonderful when you're all together, a little awkward on Zoom, but we'll figure it out. And as you probably heard when you signed on, we are recording this program for broadcast on Wacom, our local cable access station, and for posting on YouTube. If you'd prefer not to be on camera, please feel free to turn off your video and stay muted. And I'll be recording the speaker view, so the slides and the speaker. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Tina Ligon, joining us from Maryland. Dr. Ligon is a supervisory archivist at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park. She's the editor of Rediscovering Black History, a blog highlighting NARA records related to the Black experience. In addition, Dr. Ligon teaches African American history at Howard Community College, and she received her PhD from Morgan State University, where her research focused on Black education in early 20th century Cincinnati. Thank you so much, Dr. Ligon, for joining us. And one more thing before we get started, just a little bit of historical context. Frederick Douglass delivered this speech, officially titled The Meaning of July 4th for the Negro, on July 5th, 1852, at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. The event was a fundraiser put on by the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. Proceeds supported Douglass's abolitionist newspaper and other anti-slavery activities, and 500 to 600 people were in attendance that day. You'll hear references to the Fugitive Slave Act, which passed 18 months earlier as part of the Missouri Compromise. It required that enslaved persons be returned to their enslavers, even if they were caught in a free state. And it made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying people who had escaped their enslavers. And so with that context, I will now turn it over to our first reader, Catherine.
Mr. President, friends and fellow citizens, the task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way, for it is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is, to me, a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude. This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. You are even now only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon.
Fellow citizens, the simple story is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your sovereign people, in which you now glory, was not then born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government, England as the fatherland, although a considerable distance from your home. Impose in the exercise of its parental prerogatives upon its colonial children such restraints, burdens, and limitations as in its mature judgment it deemed wise, right, and proper. But your fathers, who had not adopted the idea of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government, your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned and remonstrated. They did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn. You can just read it from this.
Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers became restive under this treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in the colonial capacity. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of a total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea, but much more so than we, at this distance of time, regarded. The timid and the prudent of that day were, of course, shocked and alarmed by it. The opposition to then dangerous thought was earnest and powerful. But amid all their terrors and effort, the serious against it, the alarming and revolutionary idea moved on in the country with it. On July 2 of 1776, the colonial Congress, to the dismay of the lovers of ease and worshippers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with the authority of a national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution. We seldom hit upon resolutions drawn upon in our day Those transparency is all equal. It resolved that the United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiances to the British Crown. Citizens, our fathers made good resolutions. They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you therefore may prosperly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ringing bolt of the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny.
Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They loved their country better than their own private interests, and all will concede that it is a rare virtue that ought to command respect. He who will, intelligently, lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times.
Pauline, you're muted.
Should I start over? I'm sorry. How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were their movements. How unlike the politicians of an hour. Their statesmen looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in the strength into the distant future, fully appreciating the hardship to be encountered, firmly believing in the right of their cause, widely measuring the terrible odds against them. Your fathers, the fathers of this republic, laid the cornerstone of the national superstructure, which has risen and still rises in grandeur around you. Of this fundamental work, this day is the anniversary. My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. Now is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work, and have done much of it well. You live and must die. You must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labor of your fathers, unless your children are to be blessed by your labor. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned frame of your fathers to cover your indolence.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, Why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. But such is not the state of the case. I say with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us.
The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your father is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in traditions or in human mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? Fellow citizens, above your natural, national, tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous, yesterday are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day from the slave's point of view. Standing here, identify with the American bondsman, making his wrongs mine. I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future.
Is Mary here? Not yet. Okay, hang on one second. So I'll do this one. Standing with God, the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion will, in the name of humanity which is outraged, in the name of liberty which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet no one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice or who is not at heart a slaveholder shall not confess to be right and just. Let me try this over here. I fancy I hear someone of my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which, if committed by a Black man, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being?
Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or to write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. When the dogs in your streets, when the fowls of the air, when the cattle of your hills, the fish of the sea, and the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then will I argue with you that the slave is a man. For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. Is it not astonishing that while we are plowing, planting, and reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian's God and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men.
Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? Would you have already declared it? Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans to show that men have a natural right to freedom? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. What am I to argue? That it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply.
What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine, that God did not establish it? that our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? I cannot. The time for such argument is past. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. Its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
Take the American slave trade, which is especially prosperous just now, and carried on in all the large towns and cities in one half of this Confederacy. In several states, this trade is a chief source of wealth. It is called the internal slave trade, in order to divert from it the horror with which the foreign slave trade is contemplated. That trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy, as an inexecrable traffic. To arrest it, this nation keeps a squadron at immense cost on the coast of Africa. Everywhere in this country, it is safe to speak of this foreign slave trade as a most inhuman traffic, opposed alike to the laws of God and of man. It is, however, a notable fact that while so much execration is poured out by the Americans upon those engaged in the foreign slave trade, the men engaged in the slave trade between the states pass without condemnation, and their business is deemed honorable. Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade, the American slave trade, sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine for the market. You know what is a swine drover. I will show you a man drover. They inhabit all our southern states. They perambulate the country and crowd the highways of the nation with droves of human stock. You will see one of these human flesh jobbers armed with pistol, whip, and bowie knife, driving a company of 100 men, women, and children from the Potomac to the slave market at New Orleans. These wretched people are to be sold singly or in lots to suit purchasers. They are food for the cotton field and the deadly sugar mill.
Mark the sad procession as it moves wearily along, and the inhuman wretch who drives them. Hear his savage yells and his blood-chilling oaths as he hurries on his affrighted captives. There, See the old man with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you please, upon the young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the babe in her arms. See too that girl of 13 weeping, yes, weeping as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. The drove moves tardily. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed their strength. Suddenly you hear a quick snap like the discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank and the chains rattle simultaneously. Your ears are saluted with a scream that seems to have torn its way to the center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with the babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child and her chains. That gash on her shoulder tells her to move on. Follow this drove to New Orleans. Attend the auction. See men examined like horses. See the forms of women rudely and brutally exposed to the shocking gaze of American slave buyers. See this drove sold and separated forever, and never forget the deep, sad sobs that arose from that scattered multitude. Tell me, citizens, where under the sun can you witness a spectacle more fiendish and shocking? Yet this is but a glance at the American slave trade as it exists at this moment in the ruling part of the United States. Fellow citizens, this murderous traffic is today in active operation in this boasted republic. In the solitude of my spirit, I see clouds of dust raised on the highways of the South. I see the bleeding footsteps. I hear the doleful wail of fettered humanity on the way to the slave markets, where the victims are to be sold like horses, sheep, and swine, knocked off to the highest bidder. There I see the tenderest ties ruthlessly broken to gratify the lust, caprice, and rapacity of the buyers and sellers of men.
Is Sybil here? I'm going to call on Sarah Hubble to please read 34, 35, and 36.
By an act of the American Congress, not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in its most horrible and revolting form. Mason and Dixon's line has been obliterated. New York has become as Virginia, and the power to hold, hunt, and sell men, women, and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but is now an institution of the whole United States. The power is coextensive with the Star-Spangled Banner and American Christianity. Where these go, may also go the merciless slave hunter. Where these are, man is not sacred. He is a bird for the sportsman's gun. By that most foul and fiendish of all human decrees, the liberty and person of every man are put in peril. Your broad Republican domain is hunting ground for men. Your lawmakers have commanded all good citizens to engage in this hellish sport. Your president, your secretary of state enforce, as a duty you owe to your free and glorious country and to your God, that you do this accursed thing. Not fewer than 40 Americans have, within the past 2 years, been hunted down and without a moment's warning, hurried away in chains and consigned to slavery and excruciating torture. Some of these have had wives and children dependent on them for bread, but of this no account was made. The right of the hunter to his prey stands superior to the right of marriage and to all rights in this republic, the rights of God included.
For Black men, there is neither law nor justice, humanity nor religion. The fugitive slave law makes mercy to them a crime and bribes the judge who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery, and 5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any 2 villains is sufficient under this hell-black enactment to send the most pious and exemplary Black man into the remorseless jaws of slavery. His own testimony is nothing. He can bring no witnesses for himself. The minister of American justice is bound by the law to hear but one side, and that side is the side of the oppressor. Let this damning fact be perpetually told. Excuse me. Let it be thundered around the world that in tyrant-killing, king-hating, people-loving, democratic Christian America, the seats of justice are filled with judges who hold their offices under an open and palpable bribe and are bound in deciding in the case of a man's liberty to hear only his accusers. In glaring violation of justice, in shameless disregard of the forms of administering law, in cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolical intent, this fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation.
Americans, your Republican politics, not less than your Republican religion, are flagrantly inconsistent. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 millions of your countrymen. You hurl your anathemas at the crowned-headed tyrants of Russia and Austria and pride yourselves on your democratic institutions, while you yourselves consent to be the mere tools and bodyguards of the tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. You invite to your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad, honor them with banquets, greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money to them like water. But the fugitives from your own land, you advertise, hunt, arrest, shoot, and kill. You discourse eloquently on the dignity of labor, yet you sustain a system which in its very essence casts a stigma upon labor. You can bare your bosom to the storm of British artillery to throw off a 3-penny tax on tea, and yet wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of the Black laborers of your country. You profess to believe that of one blood God made all nations of men to dwell on the face of all the earth, and hath commanded all men everywhere to love one another. Yet you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own.
You declare before the world and are understood by the world to declare that you hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet you hold securely in a bondage which, according to your own Thomas Jefferson, is worse than ages of that which your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose, a 7th part of the inhabitants of your country. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham. Your humanity is a base pretense, and your Christianity is a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and add a byword to a mocking earth. Be warned, a horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breasts of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and flee from the hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 million crush and destroy it forever.
Allow me to say, in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Nations do not now stand in the same relation to each other that they did ages ago. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot round in the same old path of its fathers without interference. The time was when such could be done, but a change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city. Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. Wind, steam, and lightning are its chartered agents. Oceans no longer divide, but link nations together. From Boston to London is now a holiday excursion. Space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. In the fervent aspirations of William Lloyd Garrison, I say, and let every heart join in saying it.
Godspeed the day
Day, human
blood shall cease to flow.
Every
In
clime
every understood claims of human brotherhood,
and
and each return for evil good,
not blow for blow.
blow. That day will come, all feuds to end, and change
Open to the faithful friend, each foe.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yes, applause for everyone. That was wonderful. We'll just give it a small pause, and then I'll hand it over to Tina. Okay, Tina, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Hard act to follow.
Yeah.
All right. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I remember back in elementary school, back in the early 1980s, myself a bit, Courtney's always talking to me about aging backwards, but we had to memorize these words. We got graded on memorizing these words. And that's all it was. We memorized these words. We never learned what they meant or what the real meaning was behind them. So good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Courtney for inviting me to give commentary on this speech. I enjoyed being part of the reading of What to the slave is the 4th of July. I'm glad that I was able to make it tonight. I went to work at the National Archives today. We had some severe storms come through the Washington, D.C. area, and I lost power for about 2 hours. So luckily, power was restored a little before 6. So I'm very glad that I was able to make it tonight with them. Frederick Douglass. I love characters in history. I like my characters, and Frederick Douglass is one of those characters. I really enjoy his life and the things that he did. As many of us are aware, Frederick Douglass was very vocal about issues concerning abolitionism and women's rights. He was born enslaved on Maryland's Eastern Shore. He escaped bondage to become an editor, a leader in the abolitionist movement, an orator, and an author. Frederick Douglass understood the contradictions of the ideals of the founding fathers and how people who looked like him were treated in the United States. And as we went through the speech, he did not hold his tongue about how he felt about these types of contradictions, about the celebration of the 4th of July, especially when you have so many people who were enslaved. I mean, Frederick Douglass is what we would consider today real talk. I mean, just think about it. Could you imagine him on Twitter? I mean, there would be some very long, very eloquent Twitter rants, posts about that. Very, very delightful, insightful, and backing. I mean, he understood the issues very well, and he could support his beliefs or his ideals on these issues that he supported. Now, as Courtney mentioned, the speech was given on July 5th, 1852 in Rochester, New York, at the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. Again, Frederick Douglass was a strong supporter of women's rights. But in this speech, he does praise the positive ideals of liberty, citizenship, and freedom. But he acknowledges that these ideals are very offensive to the thousands of enslaved men, women, and children in the country. I mean, think about it. How can the founding fathers incorporate these ideals of life, liberty, freedom in the Declaration of Independence, and then further incorporate them into the Constitution of the United States, but at the same time they hold human beings in bondage? Let alone they celebrate these ideals annually on July 4th without even considering the hypocrisy of the holiday. I mean, Douglass gave credit to the contributions of the founding fathers for the ideals of freedom, their bravery, and the ability to create a new country where all men are created equal. That's always, once I started becoming more into history and start studying more, that's the part where I really started to stick out to me. All men are created equal in 1776. Who were they referring to? Were they referring to Native Americans? Were they referring to poor men, women, or free Blacks or enslaved Blacks? You know, who were the ideals of all men are created equal? And then when you think about it, how are we interpreting that today? You know, the founding fathers spoke out and even fought against their personal mistreatment and wrongs against the British. I mean, they felt that they had a right to fight for their freedom. Hence is why we have had the Revolutionary War. They didn't like how they were being treated. They felt they were being oppressed, but they had the right to fight for their own freedom. But Frederick Douglass acknowledged that, yes, that's fine. So why is it a problem when someone like him, who was a fugitive, wants to step out and fight for his own freedom. And the founding fathers, not to take away everything that they did. And I was mentioning to Courtney before this started, I found myself kind of mixed up in a little controversy dealing with the founding fathers. Last year, after the murder of George Floyd, the Archivist of the United States set up a task force on racism. And I was honored to be selected to serve on this task force. And we worked many months looking at issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the National Archives. And the task force was broken out into 3 groups. I was able to serve on the diversity and inclusion group. We had a museum subgroup, and we also had a archival description group. And we created a report. The report is about 106 pages. I mean, it's not fully 106 pages. A lot of it is glossary and appendix. And we made the report public last week. And one of the recommendations that the museum group made, let me backtrack. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the rotunda at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The rotunda is the home to the Charters of Freedom, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. Even in the back in the corner, you'll find the Magna Carta. And you also have paintings of the founding fathers. Well, one of the recommendations that the museum group made was to reimagine the rotunda. Now, this was established back in 1935. And they want to imagine it. They want to make it more inclusive. They want to tell the stories of everybody's foundings in Americans. I mean, women, Native Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans. They want to make it more inclusive. Well, our friends at Fox News got hold of the report, and apparently we now hate America and we want to get rid of the founding fathers. That's not what we're doing. Looking at the words of Frederick Douglass, we are still looking at the contributions. We're not getting rid of the Declaration of Independence. We're not getting rid of the Constitution, but we do want to create a real story of the founding of America. It was not just the founding fathers, but there were other people who contribute to what makes this country what it is today. And this is a story that we want to tell in the future. Luckily, the archivists have signed off on the recommendations. You can Google it. It's out there. You can see the story. And also the report is made, the report is public. You can go to the National Archives website and get the report. But I really appreciate Douglass pointing out the numerous contradictions of the founding fathers for the ideologies in the founding of the United States. And I like how he really gave particular attention to the issues with the domestic slave trade or the internal slave trade. You have to remember, Frederick Douglass was a fugitive. And that was one of the things that he kind of cherished. A lot of abolitionists had offered to pay for his freedom, but he was like, he should not have to pay for his own freedom. Who else has to pay for their freedom? And in 1850, as part of the Compromise of 1850, when you have the Federal Fugitive Slave Act, his life was in danger. You have slave catchers going into quote unquote northern states where he's supposed to be free and capturing free blacks. I mean, we're all familiar with the story of Solomon Northrop, 12 years a slave. He was born free. He just gave a performance in Washington, D.C., and ended up spending 12 years as an enslaved in New Orleans. So even as a free person of color, your life was still in danger. You still were not free to walk down the street. Even if you were in New York, Boston, Cincinnati, wherever, you could still be enslaved. And we're talking about ideals of freedom. And Frederick Douglass slammed this type of practice. the internal slave trade. Not only was it that free Blacks and even fugitive Blacks, people who are taking their own freedom, you cannot even take your own freedom if you were enslaved. Remember, the founding fathers fought a war for their freedom. And here you have somebody on a plantation, maybe Alabama, who wants to be free but cannot. And Frederick Douglass was very opposed to that idea. In addition, not only was the internal domestic slave trade, taking people's freedom, but Blacks were viewed not as human beings. I mean, they were viewed as no different than farm animals. They were put on auction blocks, examined, people bidding on them. Your life has a price tag on it. You have a price tag. You are at a certain value with that. You're not a person. And in addition, you see the separation of Black families. Maybe somebody don't want to buy a mother with a nursing child. Maybe they just want the mother. They would leave the child. Or they have no problem breaking up a husband and wife. Maybe they just need the husband and they have no problems breaking up. Again, they were not viewed as human beings. These ideals of all men are created equal, but yet you have a time where Black people were not even considered as human beings, could not even keep the family unit. And one thing that we continue to hear in the news is we always talk about, it's America, this is not who we are. I mean, also, even in the late 19th, early 20th century, the United States still continued this type of practice with Native Americans, removing Native American children and putting them in schools to make them more American. And then we heard this in the last couple of years with the situation at the southern border, the separation of children from their parents. Again, that's not new. This whole ideal of freedom that the founding fathers fought for. Who are they talking about? He also touched a little bit on the ideals of religion and the church. Now, this can get very controversial because this is very kind of, the church was used to keep people in bondage. I love how Frederick Douglass points out, you claim to love God, but yet at the same time, you're treating these folks the way that you're treating them. I mean, Frederick Douglass, when he was enslaved, before he escaped, he was sent to a plantation to be quote unquote broken because his master thought he was too highly of himself. So he needed to be broken down. He was heavily abused. Many, many, many slaves were abused. I tell my students all the time, there was nothing good about slavery. Don't let nobody tell you, even if they were singing, there was nothing good about slavery. Even with the church did not, the church supported this system of slavery. They allowed for this abuse. They allowed for the separation of the family. And it's like you see this contradiction or this hypocrisy of Christianity, this love, but at the same time, they're not showing this love for their fellow man. Douglass also goes in and talks about the Constitution. When you think of the US Constitution, I always point out there's three parts of the Constitution that supported slavery. You have the 3/5 compromise, which is what the South wanted, where their slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. Again, this goes into representation in Congress. You also have an early Fugitive Slave Act in the Constitution, an earlier, not as strict or as more regulated as the one in 1850, but there was a Fugitive Slave Act where people would have to be returned. Somebody ran away, you have to return them to their owner. And it also is interesting, the Constitution also allowed for an additional 20 years of the international slave trade. Now, Frederick Douglass does acknowledge that they ended that, which they did in 1808 or 1807, going blank. But then you have the internal slave trade that picks up. Now, as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about 2021. And I do this all the time with a lot of my friends, so they're kind of used to me. But I do polls with them. I just pick a random group of my friends and I send them a text message. So I did it this weekend. And I know people from all backgrounds. I know folks from all over the country, various age ranges, backgrounds, life experience, everything. So I just decided to do a poll, and I selected my Black friends. And I texted all of them, and I said, in 2021, what does the 4th of July mean to you? And they all, most of them responded, but they responded because they probably figured I was using this for something, so they know me. And they all gave me the PC answer. You know, oh, this was when the United States declared its independence from Great Britain, or this was America's independence. And I was like, that's not the answer I'm looking for. So I rephrased my question and I asked them, as a Black person, what does the 4th of July mean to you in 2021? And I got back honest answers. And they were all about the same. Besides the day off, nothing. Another person responded, Sunday, not a thing, nothing. Doesn't really mean anything to me. I get to barbecue, but that's it. You know, one person responded, well, we already had our holiday. We had Juneteenth. But it's very interesting. You know, we look at how Frederick Douglass condemned the 4th of July. And people today, you know, they like the day off. I mean, I thought it was interesting. They stressed that they got a paid day off. But it doesn't mean, I mean, it's like they don't think about it. They was like, it means nothing to me. It means nothing to me right now. It's not that important with that. And this is so interesting that their opinions were not very different from those from Frederick Douglass. I mean, people still feel that the 4th of July is not a holiday worth celebrating because since at the time when America fought for their freedom, many of their ancestors were enslaved. This is not my holiday. My people were not free when they fighting for freedom. It's interesting when you think about it. Since Frederick Douglass gave this speech 169 years ago, I actually had to do the math. I don't typically do math, but 169 years ago, there has been some legislative actions to give people of African descent the same rights that the founding fathers had. I mean, following the Civil War, there was the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men, a lot of people get that mixed up, I always have to stress, is men, the right to vote. And then in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. They gave women the right to vote. Now, although you have the 15th and the 19th Amendment, you still got to consider many African Americans in the South still could not vote. I mean, you have literacy tests, intimidation, and outright violence that was keeping them away from the polls. I mean, you had beginning in the 1950s and really picking up in the 1960s, organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who was going into the South to register people to vote. And as we know, they faced a lot of violence. I mean, in 1961, when they were doing the freedom rides throughout the South, their bus was bombed in Anniston, Alabama, on Mother's Day. You also have Freedom Summer of 1964, where you have an interracial group of students going into Mississippi to register people to vote. And unfortunately, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman are murdered for just trying to register people to vote. If you look at Mississippi today, I was looking at some numbers today. They was talking about vaccination rates. Mississippi is the worst in the country. They're only at 45%. I mean, Mississippi has not changed much in the last few years with that. you still have a lot of people who are not able to vote in Mississippi in 2021. In 1965, you have SNCC being joined with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they have the marches out of Selma. I mean, it took them 3 tries to get out of Selma just to bring attention to voting rights. I mean, most of you probably seen the movie or seen the videos. 3 times just to get out of Selma. Voting was very important, and they were able to get the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Now let's bring it to today. In 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby v. Holder. It removed Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. If you're not familiar with Section 5 was of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 meant that certain states would have to get federal permission before they can change their voting laws. These are primarily southern states. This is so that southern states would not pass legislation to prevent people from voting. In 2013, the Supreme Court removed this piece of legislation. Now, we do know there is current legislation held up in Congress right now to fix this. But right now, when that passed, the floodgates open. You have a lot of your southern states, even some northern states, who are passing voter restriction laws. I mean, just today, if you're not familiar today, the Supreme Court upheld the voter restriction laws in Arizona. What could that lead to with that? I mean, we saw with the election of 2020, when you have a record number of voter turnout, and we're seeing states like Texas, Georgia. I mean, you cannot even give people bottled water in Georgia. You know, I was talking to some of my friends in Atlanta, and they was talking about how they're going to get past, you know, since they can't give out water in Georgia, they would say, maybe we can pass out champagne bottles. I told them, I said, if you really want to make them mad, pass out Pepsi. You know, that's me sometimes being petty with that. But you now start to see, we're seeing this flood of going back to who can have this right to vote. Back to the ideals that Frederick Douglass was so like pointing out, you know, who are all men are created equal. Then, in addition, not just voting rights. I mean, we're in the 21st century. You know, we're supposed to be like the Jetsons. We're supposed to, I mean, we have just about everything. We don't have the flying cars, but, you know, we got the computers, we got the little robots that can come do your vacuuming and everything. I mean, you don't have Rosie, but I mean, I'm dating myself. You know who the Jetsons are. Quietly, I think we're a little better than the Jetsons, but as far as technology, except for the flying cars. But we are starting to see more and more laws being passed to restrict and hinder the rights of workers. You know, people are still fighting for a fair wage. I mean, one of the current debates, which I find very interesting, is the issue of people returning to work after COVID, especially in like the restaurant industry. Are people, you know, a lot of people making the argument that, hey, they're making more money on unemployment, or is it that people are finally realizing the value of their work? And they're like holding out, like, you pay us, we'll come out. You pay us a fair wage, we'll come out. I don't know. You also seeing the attack of rights of women. You know, issues with women's health are back in the forefront. LGBTQ, you know, a lot of legislation about restriction on transgender girls in sports. Mass incarceration. You know, Frederick Douglass mentioned in his speech the ideal that judges got paid for people who was captured to return them to slavery. I mean, we have a rise in private prisons where prisons are getting paid per prisoner, the rise in mass incarceration. And then even, currently one of my favorite newest attacks, which I'm trying to figure out is really should not be an attack, but the current attack on critical race theory. I'm looking at it like it's just history. It's like almost like a made up, but it's a new attack on this ideal of critical race history. Oh my gosh, we're trying to teach about everybody's history. That's a problem. Frederick Douglass strongly believed in ideals of political freedom, and he wanted everybody to achieve the ideals the founding fathers set place. I mean, the ideals, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution on paper, Frederick Douglass supported. Those are great ideals. The problem was not everybody was able to benefit from these types of notions. So I'm just going to close with one of my other favorite characters in history, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. And she has a very famous quote that I think really ties this in. Nobody's free until everybody's free. I'll repeat that. Nobody's free until everybody's free. There is still a lot of work to be done for everybody to reach these true notions of life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. That was great. This concludes our time together for the evening. I'll hang around. Maybe Tina can hang around for 5 minutes for any questions or comments. But I want to thank you all for participating, and please keep your eye on the library calendar for future events. And I'm also going to send an email poll out with just a few questions. We would love your feedback on this event and your ideas for future programs. So I'll release you if you need to go. Hang out if you'd like. Thank you so much, and thank you, Tina.
Thank you again for having me.